The Trump team meets with the Kremlin about a ceasefire.
Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
So what leverage does the Trump administration have with Russia?
They obviously have more leverage over Kyiv because it's the weaker party and it's very dependent on the United States. But the United States does have leverage over Russia.
Today is Thursday, March 13th, and this is The Issue from the Voice of America.
I'm Scott Walterman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori London.
We are getting good signals outside of Russia.
President Donald Trump, during an Oval Office meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, on what he's hearing from his team meeting with the Kremlin on the U.S. proposed ceasefire with Ukraine. Rutte praising Trump's efforts to end Russia's war in Ukraine.
The fact that you did that you started the dialogue with the Russians and the successful talks in Saudi Arabia now with the Ukrainians, I really want to commend you for this.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed in principle to a ceasefire. He's saying there's still a lot to clarify, and any deal needs to lead to long-term peace and eliminate the original roots of the crisis.
Таким, которое привело бы к долгосрочному миру и устранило бы.
Now, Putin did say that he would like to have a conversation with Trump directly, maybe on the phone. Trump responded positively to that suggestion.
And yeah, I'd love to meet with him or talk to him, but we have to get it over with fast. You know, every day people are being killed. It's not like, as we sit here, 2 people will be killed. Think of it.
According to Reuters, a day earlier, Moscow presented the U.S. with a list of demands to end its war in Ukraine, including preventing Kyiv from joining NATO, ruling out foreign troops in the country, and recognizing Russian sovereignty over 4 provinces it claims to have annexed.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Thursday that Putin is preparing a rejection of the ceasefire proposal, but is scared to say it directly to Trump. Zelensky, speaking in his evening address, said Russia is setting conditions on a ceasefire to delay it or make it not happen at all.
Let's talk more about it with one of our go-to people for context. Jennifer Kavanagh is a senior fellow and director of military analysis at Defense Priorities.
Thank you for being able to talk to us about this today.
Thank you for having me.
So the first messaging from Moscow was, there's nothing in this ceasefire for us. And that became, we agree sort of to the ceasefire, but there's a lot of conditions that have to be met. What does that say about where we are in the process?
One thing that we've known since the beginning is that Putin really has the upper hand over Ukraine when it comes to these negotiations because they are winning on the battlefield right now. So Putin has very little incentive to settle unless he's getting the terms that he wants. Ukraine is on the back foot. We've seen Russia reclaim most of the territory that Ukraine was holding in Kursk. Ukraine suffered another setback due to U.S. pause in military aid. So Putin really has a significant advantage here and has no incentive to stop pressing until he thinks he's going to get a deal that he likes. And so I think that's what we're seeing now is him using that leverage to try to get better terms.
Right, and the senior aide to Russian President Vladimir Putin said that the ceasefire would basically allow Ukrainian forces to regroup. But wouldn't it be both sides that would be able to kind of do that?
Of course, both sides would be able to regroup in any type of ceasefire, but Ukraine needs that regrouping more. Russia, although they have suffered tremendous military losses and are relying on North Korean forces to fight in Kursk and have burned through several armies' worth of material at this point, still has the upper hand on the battlefield and can keep going for much longer. Just because it is so much bigger, it has so many more people, and its industrial capacity is just so many times greater than Ukraine's. So while a ceasefire would allow both parties to rest and refit and rebuild their militaries a little bit, 30 days isn't that much, but it gives you a little bit of time. Ukraine just needs it much more. Their lines are on the verge of collapsing.
What would Russia want? I mean, what would be their ask? We understand that they've made some asks, but we don't know what they are.
Well, in the short term, they might try to attach conditions to the 30-day ceasefire, things to help them consolidate their gains, like no U.S. military aid during the 30-day period to limit the amount that Ukraine is able to rebuild its stocks and its arsenal. They might ask, and I think they have asked for formal recognition of their sovereignty over the territories that they've claimed in Ukraine. That would give them, a feeling of assurance that those territories now are under their domain, and a feeling of finality in terms of the battle over those specific pieces of land. So those are sort of near-term things. If they're willing to accept a 30-day ceasefire at all, there's been some indications from Putin that he'd really prefer to keep pressing on the battlefield until a final deal is settled. In effect, using the military leverage that he has to keep pressing until he gets the best possible final deal with no sort of ceasefire that would give Ukraine time to take back even a little bit of that leverage.
Right. And Ukraine has said that, obviously Ukraine needed to do this to show that it wasn't an obstacle to peace. But ultimately, it's saying what Russia wants what it wants, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. Ultimately, we've heard that Ukraine wants a guarantee of security and et cetera, for the long term. What does Russia want? What is its endgame? Do we know?
I mean, ultimately, I think what Russia wants is control over Ukraine politically. And that could come in a number of forms. They're not going to be able to conquer all of Ukraine, which was the start goal of their invasion in 2022. But I think what they're hoping for is a Ukraine that is neutral, that is not attached to NATO, that has no security guarantees, and that it has as small a military force as possible. I think Russia would also like to see Zelensky gone and a political leader in Kiev who is favorable to Russia or that they can control. That would be their ultimate goal. Now, I don't think that the Trump administration sees that as something that's in U.S. interests. That outcome is not in U.S. interests. So I don't think they'll get all of that. But because they do have this military advantage, Putin has an incentive to keep pressing to get as much of those maximalist demands as possible.
So you think that they're just going to probably keep fighting until if and when they can get any kind of negotiation going?
I mean, it's possible. It's also possible that right now they're playing hardball and that they are willing to negotiate some type of interim ceasefire, but that they don't want to do that with Witkoff, or that they don't feel that right now the terms that they've been given are sufficient, or that they want to wait until they've fully claimed the territory in Kursk. So there's a number of things that could happen. It also depends a little bit on how the Trump administration plays this. They do have leverage over Russia, a number of different types. One is a willingness to discuss some of the issues that Russia sees as the core of this conflict, like the U.S. role in Europe's security architecture. They can push on sanctions. They haven't worked that well, but there are still some things the U.S. could do to put economic pressure. Or they could say, well, if you don't want to negotiate, we will increase military aid to Ukraine. So there's a couple of things the Trump administration could do to try to press Moscow. The question is whether or not they're willing to do that. But I do think one thing we're seeing here is how tough these negotiations will be. I think there was hope that they would be quick and easy, and I think that is quickly becoming a false hope. It's apparent that this will take time.
Well, I was going to ask you, since Trump seems to so far have significant amount of leverage with Ukraine. And I was going to ask you basically what you just said. What kind of leverage does Trump have with Russia? Because there have been questions about it. But it sounds like what you just said, there are options for the White House.
There are options. They obviously have more leverage over Kyiv because it's the weaker party and it's very dependent on the United States. But the United States does have leverage over Russia. And I think, if I were advising the negotiating team, I would try to really stress that point, that the U.S. is the player here that has the most leverage and should negotiate from a position of strength, not weakness.
Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That was Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities.
You've been listening to The Issue from the Voice of America.
On behalf of Scott and myself here in Washington and all of us at VOA here and around the world, we thank you so much for joining us.
And you can get news 24/7 on our website. It's voanews.com.
In Washington, I'm Lori London.
And I'm Scott Walterman.
We'll talk to you tomorrow.